Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Go to shiftingculturepodcast.com to interact or donate. Don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app to get notified when new episodes come out. And if you're enjoying the show, let your friends and network know about it. Previous guests on the show have included Brian Sanders, Alan Hirsch, and Michael Frost. You could go back and listen to those episodes and more. But today's guest is Bree Mills. Bree is an ordained Anglican minister, a director of Microchurches Australia, and a doctoral student in the area of missional leadership, focusing on innovative leadership in the Australian context. Bree and I have a great conversation around microchurches, meeting the needs of the community, creating psychological safety, team-based leadership, and a lot more. Bree has a lot of wisdom to share. I know you're going to enjoy this one. So here's Bree. Bree, welcome. Welcome to the podcast. I'm excited to have you on.
Thanks, mate. It's good to be here.
Yeah, it's really good. I'd love to hear your journey into the small, into the micro. How did you get into missional communities and then into microchurches? What did that look like for you?
Yeah, so the journey actually begins a lot longer than most people realize. Is that for me, this started when I was working in youth ministry. So I was working in a small church in a particular area of Melbourne in an Anglican church, and quite an old-fashioned Anglican church. And I began some work down at the local high school, and we're reaching kids and starting to engage there. But it became really evident that those kids were not going to come back into the church as we knew it in that space. And so we started playing around with some things there. They built a shed, literally like a tin shed in the back of the church that became the youth space. And that's kind of where we started playing around with smaller other forms of church. Fast forward a couple of years, I went into a bigger church whose youth ministry had kind of waned down to about 20. It was a church of about 500, 600 people. And they asked me to take what I'd done at this little church and give it a go on a larger context. And so we did that. And, over about 5 years, God just did some cool stuff. We saw about 80 kids in discipling relationships kind of by the end of that stage. And then God literally kind of called me to do the same things with adults, because I was at one of those career confessed youth pastors. I was never going to grow out of youth ministry. I was never going to move on to real ministry. I was sold that is where I was, until God said, no, it's not.
Yeah. That's always tough when God says, no, I want you here. I want you in this other area. And you are reticent to go. But, it's probably the best place for you is where God wants you and is leading
Always. You. Yeah, completely. And I can see for me how that was that was God's call for me to move out of where I'm comfortable. So I'd become really comfortable in youth ministry. I was good at it. I knew how to do it. I felt, and to be honest, it became me relying on my own strength rather than relying on actually God's leadership. And by God actually calling me to kind of move outside the church with our adults and our congregations and start to explore smaller communities, that definitely drove me outside my comfort zone and back in a really dependent space on Him.
And it seems like journeys in all of our lives, once we get out into that space of being uncomfortable, into a space of liminality where you can't really know exactly what's going on. You're driven back into a place of being dependent on God, of like, this is really where I need to find my worth and my value.
Totally,
and so what did that look like, and how did that shift and change your relationship with God during that time of being uncomfortable?
Yeah, I think it was the best thing He could have done for me. I think to be honest, there are some days I think, man, it was hard, but it was so beautiful, because I often say to people that they want you to come and talk about microchurches, and I'm like, I didn't set out to start a network of microchurches.
Yeah,
I just set out to follow Jesus into the neighborhood, and that's what Jesus did, and I just obediently kind of ran behind. But I think it taught me something really important in terms of just an attitude and a posture of what does it look like to always be asking that question, God, what are you doing here? So what are you doing in the community around me? What are you doing in the people I'm discipling? What are you doing kind of globally in our world? and what are you asking me to do in this space? There's something really freeing about that, because it means you're only focusing on the things in front of you.
Yeah.
You're not focusing on, God, how do you want me to build a 500-person church and, grow a monster ministry? It's literally just, today, God, what's in front of me? What do you want me to do with that? And what does faithfulness look like in that space? And what does it look like to be faithful to you in this space? And I think that's a posture that I've really kept since that time, that I probably didn't walk in as much as I might have liked to say I did before then. Certainly I've learned how to do that at a much deeper level, and to be content with whatever it is that God calls you into in those spaces. So
and so, I mean, we have a lot of churches and a lot of leaders at the moment that are, or that have been, at least pre-COVID, were at a place where vision was driving them, that they were doing a lot of things out of their own strength, because they can. Like, I know that I could probably build something out of my own strength, and I could grow it to a certain level. And so what is that posture change of drive and vision and going after growth, and the posture change towards faithfulness in the little things and what's in front of you, the places that it's saying, hey, this is the thing that I need to be faithful to you today. How does that change the church around us and our engagement with the community around us?
Yeah, I think, one of the things that comes to mind straight away is just how attentive I am to the community around me now. I think I would have, before moving in this space, there would have been 80% of my attention that went to the needs of the people within my church and what they're asking for and what they want, and how do we build this ship, bigger. Whereas I would say now, probably at least, maybe not 80%, but at least kind of 60, 70% of a lot of my time and my focus is actually on the needs of the community around me, and going, well, what are they? Where is God at work? Because that work of kind of discerning what is God calling us to in this space is actually quite a complex work. It requires a lot of attention and focus and thoughtfulness and prayer and conversations with local stakeholders and things like that. So I think it's really shifted just how much of my focus is beyond our church buildings compared to before that. Yeah.
As you're engaging the community and you're engaging in these different missional spaces, the different microchurch network, coming from an Anglican background, how has like high church and liturgy informed some of what is being done in the microchurch setting, and how does that play with one another?
Yeah, it's interesting because I probably come from the lowest Anglican church that exists in Australia. So liturgy is not something I learnt, to be honest, within the Anglican church in the early days, but it is something that I've seen and found a new value for in some of the microchurches. Some of the ways that, we're probably, most people would look at us and probably wouldn't be able to guess that we're Anglican. But some of the practices and the liturgy they do, the repetition is a great way for people to, just really be formed and grasp. It's like those missional practices, spiritual practices. As we get people engaged in doing the same things over and over and over again, it actually helps to sharpen and form who they are. And we don't use a lot of liturgy in a lot of our spaces. But we do use some, but it's really intentional and it's really contextually where that's appropriate. So each of our microchurches looks incredibly different. Some will use none, some will use a lot more. But yeah, it's really just about realizing that there is a wealth of wisdom and history and practices that we can draw from, and we draw pretty broadly. So I'm a big Lectio Divina fan. So we steal practices from lots of different groups and denominations. And it's really about what is actually going to help us to make disciples in the space that we're in, and to be a blessing to that community.
So what does it look like in different communities and different small spaces? Are there different different models and different microchurches and different things that are being done to meet the needs of that community, or is there something that is more standard? So are you following some principles and guidelines? Are you following a certain model? What does that look like for you?
Yeah, so in Australia, we've kind of made a bit of our own model, I guess. We've got similarities to Brian Sanders and the Underground guys. We've stolen a few tools from the old school 3DM kind of movement, and there's probably a few others we've borrowed from along the path. But we're pretty simple in terms of what we try and do. We try and keep it as simple as possible, because that's how you multiply it.
Yeah.
So if this is too big or too heavy, then everyday lay people who have full-time jobs doing other things can't pick it up and run with it. And so some of the simple principles we have are, holding on to, we have 4 principles that we talk about when it comes to a microchurch, that they've got to be spaces of worship, spaces of community, spaces of mission, and spaces of partnership. So that's where we probably differ with some of the others who hold to an ecclesial minimum, that we would hold that actually as churches, we're actually called to be in partnership, whether that's within a network of microchurches. We got some microchurches who are in partnership with existing kind of traditional churches, but just I think the scripture calls Christians to unity.
Yeah.
And those partnerships look different. Sometimes they're actually really quite hands-on and resource sharing. Sometimes they're just kind of heart level partnerships where congregations are joined and connected. But yeah, we like to encourage microchurches that they don't exist in isolation, and that's not healthy to exist in isolation.
Yeah, that's very true. That need a network. And, I'll just give you an example of, I was in the Middle East for many years with my wife, and we were working with Muslim background people. Yeah. When they started to follow Jesus, they started to form small, simple churches in their homes. They couldn't go to an existing Christian church; it just wouldn't work whatsoever. And so, as we're sitting in there, one of the things that really helped those small churches, the micro churches that were being formed in those communities, was that they needed to hear and know that they're connected with others, that it wasn't just them that was doing this. There were more people. Yeah. And so, we were working primarily with Syrian refugees. And so there was a network that was not just in the country we were, but back into Syria, and, things were happening. And as the stories were being shared across the network as it formed, people's hearts grew, and they realized that there was something bigger. There's a bigger purpose to it than just this little isolated incident, that they had. It was really important for them.
Yeah. And I think you see that in the New Testament, right? You see Paul kind of sharing stories with the different churches about what's going on in other churches. Yep. And it warms their heart. It calls them to prayer. I think it's, if you've ever been a part of a microchurch that's, been through a tough time, or it's just, really struggling, then connecting with other microchurches who are flourishing or who are having similar struggles, and can say, hey, this is what we've been doing. Maybe this is, something you can try. I mean, that was what really gave our network life, I think, was the connections that we maintained between the different microchurches, specifically at a leadership level. Yeah. That was just a really healthy space that energized our communities to really flourish.
Yeah. So how do you help your bivocational or co-vocational leaders as they're trying to shepherd these spaces and the people that are in these microchurches? What does that look like for you and your network as you're helping them live out their daily walk with Jesus, and then shepherding others to be able to do the same?
Yeah, so we always like to see ourselves as like a resource hub. Like this is the bit that almost like the scaffolding that comes under you and around you and supports you in what you're doing. So we did a lot of stuff with our leaders, particularly like one-on-one coaching once a month. We had a term gathering once a term that was for all of our leaders to gather together and to support and encourage one, get some training, get some learning. Sometimes that's from me. Sometimes that's actually from the different leaders who have learned something along the way.
Hmm.
in their journey as a microchurch. Most of our leaders, so very few of our microchurch, actually almost none other than our pastor who runs it, are paid. So they're all doing full-time work or full-time motherhood or something like that. So they're all in the same boat in that way, which I think helps them. But I think one of the things about the bivocational means that you must have a good team around them.
Yeah.
Like this is not solo pastor territory.
Yeah.
Like if you're doing stuff that's bivocational, you really need to live out that kind of, whether you want to call it the fivefold gifts or that kind of team-based polycentric approach to mission. It's the only way you can do it. You can't leave one person to pastor a community of 20, 30 people and run a full-time job. So it's got to be a team-based approach and a team-focused effort. Yeah.
And so what are the things that you've seen that are working as a team-based approach? What are the values that need to be set in a place where we could have that instead of a solo leader?
Yeah, lots of things. I think there's lots of things to make it work in that sort of space. Gosh, one of the big concepts I'm big on at the moment, is psychological safety, which is it's kind of this old teams idea, but actually it's really important when you have these leadership teams that they feel like they can say, I'm not doing okay. Can someone else pick up some of the load? Or I'm struggling in my relationship with Jesus at the moment. Can some others come around me and take the load of running the missional community, but come around me? And I feel like the teams that we've seen most flourish are the teams where it's okay to be not okay and still be in and around the leadership team.
Yeah.
I think years ago there was this old kind of idea where if someone's struggling, you kind of step them down from leadership and push them to the side to get counselling and move them away.
Yeah.
But one of the things that we've seen is what does it look like to embrace people and leaders in all seasons of their life? When their life is in tatters as well as when it's doing well, and the credibility that gains you when you hold with someone who's struggling. And the willingness and the buy-in and the trust that develops in those leadership teams, I think that's been really priceless, and that's really glued some of our teams together really for quite a long time.
How do you build that psychological safety within teams? Because it doesn't happen right away.
No, and I think it's bigger than building trust. So if you look at kind of Patrick Lencioni's work, he's like, the first thing that teams is building trust. But I think it's beyond that. It's both your emotional intelligence, so your awareness of where people are at and the way you respond to that. So if you see that people are struggling and you choose not to engage with that, then you're actually degrading your psychological safety. But I think it's also the way we respond to other people's thoughts and ideas. And I think this is really important if you're going to cultivate a network of microchurches as much as if you're just leading a microchurch team. Yeah. Like if you're cultivating a network and somebody says, hey, what if we, had an idea over here, let's go shoot at this one. And you knock it down, or you say, I don't think that's where God's at. I think you degrade that safety and then you don't have people come to you with those crazy ideas, which, my experience is a lot of the time they are crazy God ideas and go for it, run with them. So I think that's been one of the things I've been really reflecting on. And it comes out of that emotional intelligence space. It comes out of our cultural awareness too, seeing the differences in our team as things to leverage and advantages rather than things that divide us or, we need to minimize this person because they're too, rambunctious or loud or whatever. Yeah. Saying, actually, how do we use that in our team? That this is what God's placed. These are the gifts he's given us. Why has he given us these? Because I work on the assumption that God's placed those people there because he wants to use them in different ways. So how are we using what God has given us?
I think that's so good especially when you're working with a network of microchurches, to be able to do that and to empower people to actually run with some God ideas, and to affirm whether they are God ideas or not, and to let them go and run wild. We need some innovation. We need risk taking, especially in this microchurch setting. As people are starting to engage the small and they're saying, okay, we're making an impact, we're making a difference. A lot of it is it hard for people to get to a place of participatory worship or participatory community, that we're all playing a part in what we're doing, in in the small area. It needs to be participatory. I mean, and some people just in my case, some people aren't ready for participation, and they've been inoculated to a non-participatory approach to church. Even people that are unchurched, they go, oh, what is this? Where we engage. We have a network of microchurches. We gather once a month as a whole network together, but we're in the homes and the communities the rest of the time. And even as I'm bringing in new people that don't yet know Jesus, haven't ever been churched, they're shocked at how participatory we are. How do we get to a place where people are excited about engaging in this participation in the body of Christ, and they're not just there to receive something for their own benefit?
Yeah, it's a good question, because we see some different patterns around this. So we often see, if you're engaging non-believers, I mean, one of our principles of how we like to gather is making it a welcoming space so that everybody comes in and is engaged, but not basically making it so that they, in those first few times that they visit, they don't actually have to, they're not forced to really do anything, and holding that sort of kind of social space dynamics in that space. But we found this pattern with Christians, particularly, who are moving into this model, that there's this reaction to begin with. They love the participatory nature. They dive right in, and then after maybe 3 months, 6 months, they're like, yeah, this is hard work. I actually have to do and prepare and organize. And it's almost like they want to revert backwards, and they want to go back to consumer church. And I've seen this swing over and over and over again. And I think there's a couple of things that we've learned. One is these communities have to be low weight. And the problem when Christians who have been in big churches start to try and run microchurches is they try and run them with a fair degree of organization and planning and program, and it becomes too heavy. It actually becomes burdensome rather than joyful. And so they feel like they're basically running a larger scale of church in their home and exhausting themselves. So trying to make sure that the gatherings that we keep, we do, all for priesthood of all believers, all for everyone participating, but in a lightweight way. What does it look like that people could actually just come, be engaged in that space without causing too much preparation? And also, how do you create the space so that people are free to participate at whatever level they're at?
Right.
And some of that, I think, echoes back again to that psychological safety. Is it okay in this space to say, I don't know where I'm at? I'm actually not sure about faith. And that actually is something the leader really has to work hard to shape in those spaces. Because if you get a strong Christian in the room who, one of your friends comes and makes a question, and we've had this, just a couple of weeks ago at our microchurch, and a strong Christian comes in and says, well, this is why you should believe X, and just kind of preaches at them for 10 minutes. You're like, wow, you've just destroyed the psychological safety of our group. Thank you very much. How do you actually help Christians to understand that this space is a space of open discussion, of conversation, of engagement together? That's been one of the things that we've really worked on. And to be honest, part of the way that we've got through this has been to really focus on bringing in non-believers and not really trying to, like when Christians say, hey, we want to come join your microchurch, I'm like, hey, how about I help you try and start one? Because when you get microchurches that are full of too many churched Christians, it changes the culture, and there's a whole lot of unlearning that needs to happen. About to relearn how you create those safe, engaging spaces where everybody gets to, engage with Jesus wherever they're at.
Do you give out? Do you have any good tips, resources to create those safe spaces, and to help leaders of microchurches create them? What sort of learning needs to happen to be able to do that and to provide those safe spaces?
Yeah. So one of the trainings that I've done sounds a bit ridiculous, but I always come back to this one. I teach people how to have a conversation.
Yes,
Because I
it's
actually
so
think in
important.
our world, we've lost the art of how to have a conversation. How do you ask questions
Yeah,
of another person rather than make statements about where you're at? How do you,
yeah,
be genuinely
mm,
curious? How do you do, active listening and deep listening to not just what they're saying, but
yeah,
what's going on behind? Um, to be honest, that's probably the biggest key that we've found is when we've taught people how
mm,
to have conversations, how to be
mm,
active listeners. And I mean, like,
yeah,
don't just listen to what they're saying, but listen to what they're saying, look at their body language, kind of learn to read the room
yeah,
and kind of increase that emotional intelligence space.
mm,
Then when you speak, you'll be far more sensitive to
yeah,
where they're at, where their needs are. Um, where we see those spaces not functioning is where we see
mm,
people behaving in ways that are either they've got an agenda to push,
yeah,
or they're not actually they're not listening, they're not engaging in that.
mm,
And then the other thing we've taught people is how do you ask a good question? Listen deeply and then learn to ask good questions, like
mm,
really deep questions, thoughtful questions. One of the things that one of the little practices we've had as a missional community is, always, like lots of people, we offer to pray for people when they tell us about something that's going wrong when we're
yeah,
walking the streets or community. I had a lady, we've got a street library out the front of our house I was talking to, and she was telling me about something that was going wrong in a friend's life, and I offered to pray for her, as lots of Christians do. But the one thing that we've asked, that we've kind of helped some of our community now to learn to do, is say, well, rather than just saying, hey, I'll pray for you, which we say first, I say, is it okay if we pray for you? And that, yeah, fine. I say, well, what would be your ideal outcome?
mm,
Like, what if God could do anything in this situation, what would you want God to do?
mm,
And it is such a good question, because then
yeah,
people go, oh, well, I'd love it if he, totally wiped the cancer away or
mm,
repaired their marriage. Or I said, well, that's, and then our response, what training people say is, okay, well, that is exactly what I'm going to be praying for.
yeah,
And it's one little question that you add on to something that we say as Christians all the time
mm,
that totally changes the depth and level of connection with people,
yeah,
and helping people realize where are those spaces where you can ask just that one more question, or that one well-worded question
yeah.
that really helps people feel loved, cared for, and that God is actually engaging in them and in their life.
Mm. That's beautiful. You're able to do that in a space and with people that you just met as well. That
Yeah,
doesn't have to be
I do
in,
that with all sorts of random people.
And
But it
that's
causes
an
questions.
art.
So
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And it's part of that. We pick on Mike's book. How do we live lives that are curious, that actually help people to ask questions of us,
Yeah.
um,
So
and
what does that
learning
look
to ask
like?
good questions.
Is learning to ask a question. We always think that we have to have the answer. We need to be the Bible answer person.
Yeah,
But really, if we follow the model of Jesus, even if he
yeah,
was asked direct questions, he often would ask a question back, or
yeah,
tell a story, do something, and he rarely gave a direct answer back.
yeah.
So how do we get to a place where we can ask really good questions, um, and good questions that see the person that we're
Mm,
talking to, and that is a gift, and an art, and it takes a lot of practice. And
yeah,
so I think that a lot of times when we're entering into this, we're gonna we're gonna suck at it at the beginning. We're not gonna be good at asking questions. We're not
and
gonna
it's
be
going to feel
good.
really awkward.
It's going to feel awkward. And how do
Yeah,
you get to a place? There's so many people out there that don't want to embrace the awkward. They don't want to embrace the difficult. They want to be comfortable, and be in our comfortable spaces. And you're in a place that you have a microchurch network where It is basically a bunch of people that have decided I want to be uncomfortable, and engage the community around me and meet the needs of the community around me in a space where it's inconveniencing to me. How can we help people take a step towards the uncomfortable, and embrace the awkward, so that we can grow and we could actually see transformational change in our communities?
Yeah, I would love to say that everyone in our network was happy with being uncomfortable and putting themselves out in inconvenience, but we're working on it. I think you start where you are comfortable doing something that's uncomfortable. So if you've got a friend, like a good friend, you start by actually, even within like a Christian small group, have a dinner one week and sit across the table from each other, pairs, and practice the art of actually asking a good question that tries to pull out and elicit a story from someone else.
Yeah.
And take it like as dorky as it sounds, take it in turns of learning to ask questions, and then actually at the end going, stop, what were some of the best questions you heard? Like the way we came up with that question for people after they praised, that somebody just came up with it one day and then shared it back to others and said, hey, I said this, and it had a great response. And we were like, cool. Okay, let's all try that. So I think it's making spaces for people to try and fail and to be honest, to have fun with it. Let's not make it into some boring training program about how to ask questions and how to listen. Do it in a fun way. Do it over food. You can even do it over silly things like, have a conversation with somebody about which is the best football team.
Yeah. And
try and actually have a conversation where you put aside your own views and you listen and engage, and see if you can sway one another in your listening. Like see if they can sway you, and just little silly things like that are comfortable, but help people practice the skill, because it's like a muscle, right?
Yeah.
You want to grow strong, you go to the gym every day and you keep practicing. So where are those spaces that you can practice actually learning to ask questions or learning to listen to others? Some of the other things that I've seen work well is kids have taken some of our team, mostly young adults, people that I've been involved in kind of microchurch missional communities with.
Well, that brings me a good point, is that we actually need mothers and fathers in the Lord, and it's okay to say kids, because if we're actually being a mother in the Lord, it's really something that's missing, and there's very few of that, and so it's okay. It's good.
But we actually have most of our communities, we would have spiritual parents, and that actually came out of our work with the youth communities. Is that when we had these youth communities, we would appoint, young adults would lead it along with a team of youth.
Yeah.
But we'd import, there'd be a family that basically took them on and became the spiritual parents of that community. And we just found so much value in that we kind of rolled out that across all the ages. But I think and that goes into all sorts of other areas around kind of the value of the cross-generational space, I think, in these spaces. But I've taken on some of our young adults who are not children as children. Yeah.
As you're looking at, what are some of the stories of some community transformation as you're starting to engage the community? You're saying, okay, what is God up to in this space? Where are the needs of my community? How do we start something? What are some community transformation that's happening?
Yeah, so one of the very early communities that we launched, probably 2013, 2014 now. One of the ones that really stands out to me because of, I think, just the specific need that we encountered was we're in an area where there's an increasing number of mainland Chinese immigrants.
Yeah.
So it would be a no-brainer to say, yep, let's do a microchurch for Mandarin speakers, right? No-brainer. But we were like, well, that's like 80% of our population. So how do we actually narrow down what God's doing in that space? And we, went on a couple of prayer walks and ended up meeting, as we walked around the community kind of during the day with this couple who was interested, we ended up meeting these families, or they were either mothers or grandmothers with
Mm.
toddlers at home.
Mm-hmm.
And what we found was happening was, as they'd immigrate, dads primarily would go off to work. They'd have great English skills. Primary age, secondary age kids would go to school. They'd have great English skills. But you'd end up with these parents and their children very isolated at home, a little bit too scared to go out to the shops, even to purchase groceries on their own, because they just, despite the fact that most of the time their English was fantastic, the confidence in their English was not great. And so one of the things we did was, as we kind of sensed what God was doing in this community, we sensed there was, there's lots of ESL programs that exist everywhere.
Yeah.
But this particular need was for parents and grandparents with toddlers to just grow some confidence around their language. And so we started like a playgroup / language cafe, so that the toddlers could come and have somewhere to engage, but the parents could just, no classes, just have conversational English, so that they could actually, and it was run by Mandarin speakers. So, they'd do a lot of it in Mandarin, and then they'd say, okay, now we have to speak English. We're trying to help you. And that became probably one of the most fruitful communities that we've seen, where we saw, incredible numbers come to faith through that community. Our biggest problem was we didn't have a Mandarin service or somewhere that they could engage with kind of on a larger scale. We do now, but we actually ended up seeing a lot of people come to faith and join lots of other Mandarin speaking congregations around us, which we were very happy and open to do. But yeah, that was one where you just thought there was a real gap in what was going on around us, and God really pointed that out to us and said, it doesn't need a big program, it doesn't need anything fancy, it just needs a group of people who want to gather with mums and their toddlers and a few toys and make a space for them to grow in confidence with their language. And they did. And that, I know of a lady from that community now who runs a playgroup in her home. And she's just still doing that work completely kind of alongside or separate to the guys who used to lead it, but just really convinced of the need to help this particular community. And it's been a really, a really positive way to engage in that tiny little gap. And that's what we've often found. We find that, we're not taking on as a network the big issues of, I don't know, sexual exploitation or, we're taking the little issues in community. Like another one was, we're in a highly educated area where, everybody's on about high academic results. People come to our area from overseas for the high schools. It's that sort of good. But we found that there was this whole group of young adults who were artistic and creative, who didn't necessarily achieve academically, who felt like second-class citizens.
Yeah.
And to be honest, I'm a doctoral student, so I wasn't part of that group. I didn't even know that group existed until one of our young adults came up to me and said, I have a heart for this particular group of people. And I said, what people? Young adults who don't achieve. I'm like, the young adults not achieving in Glen Waverley? Aren't they all like high achievers? She was like, no, there's this sub-community of people who are incredible artists who need to understand that the gifts and the abilities that they've given them, God's given them to bring beauty and joy and life in our world. And so she did. She launched this great community for these artists and others that I think would have been very undervalued and certainly unseen in our community, and really brought what they did to life. So, so we find the little nooks and crannies rather than the big issues that the organizations are working towards.
Yeah.
So,
I love the little nooks and crannies, and you could see, just how the little things and the small things and just a few people can go and transform something big, as you're seeing, even those play groups are starting to multiply out, and you're going to have that impact either even further down the line that you're not going to actually know what's going on, because it keeps on multiplying out, because people are affected by it, and they're saying, oh, this is valuable, I want to participate in it. And it's those small groups of people that could actually go out and change communities and change the world. Have you seen evidence of that throughout history, Have we seen some of these small groups starting to change the world? What does that look like? Have we seen it before, or is this something that's new and happening now?
Yeah, no, look, I think there's something about it that's being renewed for our time.
Hmm.
But I don't think it's new. I think there's history will tell you that small groups of people have been what brought around most of the kind of um, revolutions, even politically, let alone
Yeah.
Christian kind of reformations over time. So, I mean, there's lots of really known stories about that with John Wesley and his little groups and bands and
Hmm.
societies and the Moravians and their work around mission. Like what they did really changed the world in a
Yeah.
couple of countries quite significantly. But it was small groups and little things popping up. I remember Howard Snyder writes a great book called The Radical Wesley that really unpacks that idea
Mm.
that what Wesley did wasn't one revival that kind of swept the country under this great preacher like a Billy Graham style.
Hmm.
It was actually a whole lot of pockets of little revivals and
Mm.
smaller communities that actually fanned the flame of revival and kept it burning across the country.
Mm.
Um, so there are those sorts of ones, but there's a lot of really unknown ones as well. Like I love talking about. I mean, I don't know if God Squad's a thing in the US, but the motorcycle gang that
Mm.
is a Christian motorcycle gang that works with outlaws and bikies and things like that.
Mm.
It was started in Australia years ago as just a bunch of people who wanted to reach those the church would never reach, and so they did, and now it's a big
Mm.
organization reaching bikies. I mean, years ago, there's the
Wow.
story of things like Mothers Union and Girls Friendly Society, all of those big organizations that we'd now see as like, not-for-profit institutions.
Yeah.
Both of those started as small groups of people who saw a need in the community.
Mm.
Mothers Union saw this need for mothers and families to be supported in kind of post-industrial
Mm.
England. And Girls Friendly Society saw these young women who were being, 12, 14-year-old girls being sent into the city to work and falling as prey to
Mm.
lots of dodgy people in the city. And they're like, nah, that's not good enough.
Mm.
We're going to build communities around these women. We're going to mentor them. We're going to support them and encourage them in the name of Jesus.
Yeah.
And that's how these organizations grew. And I probably don't know half of them. But there's hundreds of them throughout history where
Mm.
people just see a need,
Yeah.
they respond kind of out of that, just general gospel love for these people. They want to see the
Mm.
fullness and the restoration of the kingdom that God intends for these people, but they
Mm.
respond in small ways. And then, I don't know, God tends to blow up small things sometimes and make them very large.
He does. He does. And it's okay to actually, see and be engaged in the small. And the problem, I think, for some people is we want to see the effectiveness. We want to see the fruit of our labors when we go after the small. We want to see that large effect, and we
Mm,
oftentimes, a lot of times, we don't get to see it, and it's kind
yeah.
of frustrating. Um, but there is something that's happening um, that is a lot larger when you engage the small and when you're actually in it
Mm,
and faithful to what God has called you to. Big things are happening, and
yeah.
there is movement that is happening on
Mm,
the edges of it. My wife earlier this year went to South Asia, train a bunch of Muslim backgrounds believers, uh, and a lot of those believers it started with a 8-year-old girl that saw a need in a community. She met an 11-year-old that was going to go
mm,
out and get married, and asked her why she's getting married and not going to school. And basically, her parents didn't have enough money. She asked how much money was it. It was like $8 a month or something. And she goes, "I have, my allowance is more than that. I have that money. Can I pay for you to
mm,
go to school?" So she paid to go for this girl to go to school, so she didn't have to get married at 11 years old. And
yep.
she went back home and she started to raise money for other girls to go to
Mm,
school and not to be married. And now a lot of people have come to faith and started to
yeah.
say yes to Jesus. And now there's a lot of work with those families telling Jesus stories in homes.
Yeah.
And it is growing from one little girl. I love this story because it's just an 8-year-old little girl who said, there's this need. I can meet the need for one and then go back and tell people about the need and say, we could do it for more. And it's started just to grow and multiply out because being attentive to what God is doing in that area and what need there is in the space.
Yeah. And I think if every Christian focused on doing exactly that, we'd change the world.
Mm-hmm.
We often think we need these big organizations and, big plans, but if actually every Christian just focused on what needs were in front of them and filling them in the name of Jesus, like that would be world changing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
It's not rocket
How do we do that?
Yeah.
Let's just do it. Let's all just engage. Let's do it. Let's see what is the need in front of you. Ask really good questions to pull that out, and then figure out how to meet that need. We could do that, and we could do that with small groups of people. Bree, I have a couple of questions here at the end. Number one, if you could go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
Oh, relax. Take life easy. I don't know. I think I was a very I had a lot of dreams and things I wanted to pursue, and I was quite passionate about those things. But I think life has taught me, and Jesus has taught me, that He is at work in this world, and it's don't. Like that, we don't need to stress and drive and push to actually do things. Like at 21, I was working in a church already as a youth pastor, and I was pushing to achieve, big church growth in a large church that, wanted to see hundreds of kids at their youth ministry. And you were so driven by that kind of need to grow this thing big, but yeah, I'd just say, just hang with Jesus, do what Jesus wants to do, and enjoy life. Like, actually, I think Christians forget that Jesus actually, he created us to actually live a full and joyful life. Like this, if it's killing us, then maybe it's not what He's asked of us. Like, I'm not saying life's not without suffering or difficulty. I definitely think that there are times that's exactly what God calls us to. But there is joy in that if you're doing that, in the right spaces and empowered by Him. So I think I'd tell myself to just chill out and relax with Jesus a bit.
It's so good. One of my favorite stories is that redemption of Peter. At the very end when Jesus, in his resurrected body, and he's about ready to go back to the Father. One of the last things he does is he has a barbecue on the beach with his friends. And that's what Jesus was about. He's like, he could do anything as some of his last acts on earth, and he just wanted to have a barbecue on the beach with his friends.
That's so good.
It's amazing.
I love it.
Yeah, and it gives me an opportunity to go to the beach, have a barbecue, grill some good fish, and then have some bread.
Sounds like an ideal day to me.
Yeah, it's amazing. Anything you've been reading or watching lately you could recommend?
Oh gosh, what have I been reading lately that I recommend? Lots. Susan Beaumont's How to Lead When You Don't Know Where You're Going, I actually think is a really valuable book for churches today. It's probably the thing I'm recommending the most to those in current church leadership, and particularly those in traditional form leadership who are finding, leading in liminal spaces a bit discouraging or uncomfortable. I just think she does a really great job of kind of joining together the kind of organizational leadership and the spiritual leadership in that space. That's probably one that's been a good joy to me at the moment. Other ones are probably, I'm a doctoral student, so the other ones might be more academic. But Stroop's Transcending Mission has been one that I've been enjoying. If you're an academic natured person and you want to talk about the whole missional church movement and the word missional rubs you up the wrong way, then Stroop is a great guy to have a read at his thoughts on that.
That's great. Bree, this was a great conversation. It was fantastic to get us to think how small groups of people could go and change the world, and faithfulness to Jesus in the small things and little things. I love the conversation and thoughts around asking really good questions, and looking to see what are the needs of the community around us, and where God is at work in the community so that we could actually go out and meet those needs. So it was a fantastic conversation. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. If anybody wants to connect with you, where can they find you?
I do have a website, breemills.com.au, but you can just find me on socials, Bree Mills on Facebook or on Instagram mostly. Yeah.
Perfect. Sounds good. Well, Bree, thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thanks, mate. It's good.
Thank you for listening to the show today. If you're really enjoying the show, please don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app. You could do it right now. Just hit that little plus. And then I would love it if you would leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. So you could go right now to the show and leave a star rating and review and let us know how you are enjoying the show. And find us on Facebook and Instagram. So if you want to connect, interact, I post a lot of quotes and different things that you could actually interact with the episodes and let me know how you are enjoying the show. If you feel inclined to donate, there is a support the show link in the show notes, and it would send you directly to a page where you could donate so that new episodes can be produced for your enjoyment. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have an incredible week.